a dusty road stretching across medieval Europe, winding through forests that have witnessed centuries of blood and prayer. The year is 1307, and a caravan of knights moves in absolute silence, their white mantles bearing the iconic red cross that once struck fear into the hearts of Saracens. But these aren't pilgrims returning with tales of glory. These are men fleeing for their lives, carrying something so dangerous that kings and popes alike would kill to possess it. You've heard the stories. The Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks who protected Christian pilgrims and amassed unimaginable wealth. History tells us they were arrested on Friday the 13th, tortured into confessions, and burned at the stake for heresy. But what if that's only half the truth? What if the real reason for their destruction wasn't greed or political maneuvering, but something far more terrifying? Because here's what the history books won't tell you. When King Philip IV of France raided the Paris Temple, expecting to find mountains of gold and silver, the vaults were empty. Not just lacking treasure, but completely barren, as if they had been cleared out months, perhaps years in advance. The Templars knew what was coming, and they moved something so valuable that it made their legendary riches pale in comparison. But this isn't about gold or jewels or even the Holy Grail as most people imagine it. This is about knowledge. Knowledge that could topple thrones, shatter the foundations of Christianity, and rewrite everything we thought we knew about the divine right of kings. Knowledge that Rome desperately wanted to control, but the Templars refused to surrender. Tonight, we're going to trace the path of that knowledge from the dusty excavations beneath Solomon's Temple to the hidden vaults of medieval Europe. We're going to explore what the Templars really found during their decades of digging in Jerusalem, why the Church turned against its most faithful servants, and how their discoveries may have survived to influence secret societies that exist to this very day. So settle in, turn off the lights, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about medieval history. Because the story we're about to uncover doesn't just challenge the official narrative, it completely obliterates it. The year 1119 marked the beginning of something unprecedented in medieval history. 9 French knights, led by Hugh de Payens, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a peculiar request. They wanted permission to protect Christian pilgrims travelling the dangerous roads to the Holy Land. Noble enough, you might think. But here's where the story gets strange. These 9 men, barely enough to protect a merchant caravan, claimed they could safeguard thousands of pilgrims across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Even stranger, King Baldwin granted them quarters in the most sacred location in all of Christendom, the Temple Mount itself, in what had once been the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. For 9 years, these knights supposedly protected pilgrims. 9 years during which historical records show remarkably little activity from them. No major battles, no significant rescues, no documented interactions with pilgrimage routes. So what were they actually doing? They were digging. Archaeological evidence suggests that during their tenure on the Temple Mount, the Templars conducted extensive excavations beneath the ancient foundations. Not random digging, but systematic, purposeful excavation guided by knowledge that went far beyond medieval understanding of engineering. They had maps, plans, specific locations they were targeting. But maps of what? And how did 9 French knights possess architectural knowledge of a temple destroyed over 1,000 years before their arrival? The answer lies in the peculiar timing of their formation. The First Crusade had ended just 20 years earlier, and Jerusalem was still reeling from the massive upheaval. Ancient libraries had been scattered, hidden texts had surfaced, and most importantly, learned men from across the known world had converged on the holy city. Scholars, mystics, and keepers of forbidden knowledge found themselves in unprecedented proximity to each other. Among these, learned men were Jewish scholars who had maintained oral traditions dating back to the Temple period. Christian monks who had preserved texts deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Islamic scholars who had spent centuries studying the sacred geometry and mystical significance of Jerusalem's ancient structures. And perhaps most intriguingly, representatives of mystery schools that claimed unbroken lineages stretching back to antiquity. The Templars weren't just knights. They were initiates, carefully selected and prepared for a mission that had nothing to do with protecting pilgrims. They were archaeological agents, operating under the cover of Christian piety to recover something that had been hidden beneath the Temple Mount for over a millennium. What they found changed everything. Traditional accounts speak vaguely of golden artifacts, ancient scrolls, maybe even the Ark of the Covenant. But the reality was far more significant than mere relics. They discovered documentation, genealogical records, ritual instructions, and most dangerous of all, historical accounts that contradicted the official church narrative about the nature of divine authority and spiritual succession. These weren't just ancient curiosities. They were political dynamite. Because if the documents were authentic, they suggested that spiritual authority didn't flow exclusively through the apostolic succession claimed by Rome. Instead, they pointed to alternative lines of transmission, different understandings of sacred kingship, and most explosively, the possibility that divine blood had continued through human lineages rather than ending with the crucifixion. The implications were staggering. If spiritual authority could be inherited rather than appointed, if sacred blood still flowed in living veins, then the entire structure of medieval Christianity was built on a false foundation. The Pope's claim to ultimate spiritual authority would crumble. The divine right of kings would be revealed as a convenient fiction, and somewhere in Europe, descendants of an ancient sacred lineage might still walk the earth, carrying within their blood a claim to spiritual leadership that predated and superseded Rome's authority. This is why the Templars became so powerful so quickly. It wasn't just their military prowess or their banking innovations. They had leverage. They possessed knowledge that could bring down the entire ecclesiastical and political structure of medieval Europe. And they used that knowledge to carve out an unprecedented position of independence and influence. But knowledge is a double-edged sword. The same information that gave them power also made them an existential threat to every crowned head and church official in Christendom, because secrets this explosive don't stay buried forever. And when they surface, they have a tendency to reshape the world in ways that those in power find deeply uncomfortable. The Templars weren't content to simply guard their discoveries. They began to build, not just castles and churches, but networks, secret systems of communication that stretched across Europe, codes and symbols that appeared in their architecture, their seals, their rituals. They were encoding the knowledge they had found, preserving it in forms that could survive persecution and suppression, and persecution was coming. Because by the late 13th century, it had become clear that the Templars knew too much. They had grown too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to the established order. The question wasn't whether they would be destroyed, but how and when. What Rome expected when they moved against the Templars was simple. Confess your heresies, surrender your wealth, and disappear quietly into monasteries where your dangerous knowledge could be safely contained. What they got instead was something far more terrifying. The Templars had prepared for this moment for decades. They had anticipated betrayal, planned for persecution, and most importantly, they had secured their most precious possession. The knowledge that could destroy Rome had been copied, encrypted, and distributed through networks that the Church couldn't even begin to comprehend. When the arrests came, when the torture began, when the flames finally consumed the last public defenders of the temple, the real treasure was already gone. Not hidden in some remote castle or buried beneath a chapel floor, but woven into the very fabric of European society through symbols, rituals, and bloodlines that would carry the dangerous truth forward through the centuries. The Church thought it was crushing a rebellion. What it actually did was scatter the seeds of its own eventual transformation across the breadth of Christendom. The destruction of the Knights Templar was supposed to be clean, surgical, final. King Philip IV had planned it meticulously. Simultaneous arrests across France, coordinated seizures of Templar properties, a swift trial followed by public executions that would send a clear message to anyone who dared challenge royal authority. But something went wrong almost immediately. The confessions extracted under torture were inconsistent, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. Templars spoke not of devil worship or blasphemous rituals, but of knowledge. Ancient knowledge that made them weep with terror even as the hot iron burned their flesh. They babbled about bloodlines that stretched back to Jerusalem, about kings who ruled by divine inheritance rather than papal appointment, about truths so dangerous that speaking them aloud could shatter the foundations of Christian civilization. Most disturbing of all were the references to something they called the sacred lineage. Not a relic, not a treasure, but people, living descendants of an ancient royal house that had supposedly survived in secret for over 6 centuries, protected by an underground network of initiates who had taken vows of silence that transcended death itself. The inquisitors pressed for details. Where were these descendants? What were their names? How could they be identified? But here, the Templars fell silent. Even under the most extreme torture, even facing the flames of execution, they would not reveal the identities of those they had sworn to protect. This silence was more terrifying than any confession could have been, because it suggested that the Templars hadn't just discovered dangerous knowledge, they had weaponized it. As news of the arrests spread across Europe, strange things began to happen. Templar ships vanished from harbours in the dead of night. Secret messages appeared in places where no messenger could have travelled, and most unnervingly, certain noble families began to display new heraldic symbols, bees, roses, geometric patterns that had never appeared in their ancestral arms, but somehow felt ancient, meaningful, deliberately chosen. The Church's investigation expanded beyond the Templars themselves. They began examining the families who had supported the order, the craftsmen who had built their churches, the scholars who had translated their manuscripts. What they found was a web of connection so vast and intricate that mapping it became impossible. Every thread led to another thread. Every symbol connected to another symbol. Every bloodline intertwined with another bloodline until the investigators realized they weren't dealing with a simple military order that had gone astray. They were confronting something that had been growing in the shadows of European society for generations, using the Templars as just one arm of a much larger organism. The most chilling discovery came from examining Templar architecture. Their churches, castles, and commanderies hadn't been built according to standard medieval designs. Instead, they followed precise geometric principles that encoded information in their very proportions. The distance between pillars, the angles of windows, the placement of doors and altars, all of it formed a vast mathematical language that could preserve and transmit knowledge without words. Scholars working for the Church attempted to decode these architectural messages and found references to something called the royal secret. Not a single piece of information, but an entire system of understanding that connected sacred geometry, astronomical calculations, genealogical records, and ritual procedures into a comprehensive framework for identifying and protecting the sacred bloodline. This wasn't just historical curiosity. It was a practical manual for recognizing legitimate spiritual authority based on inheritance rather than appointment. And copies of this manual, encoded in stone and timber, stood in dozens of locations across Europe, impossible to destroy without demolishing buildings that had become integral to their communities. The Church found itself facing an impossible choice. They could attempt to destroy every structure that contained encoded Templar knowledge, but doing so would require explanations they couldn't provide without revealing the very secrets they were trying to suppress. or they could leave the buildings standing and hope that future generations would lack the keys to decode the messages hidden in their walls. They chose the latter, but added their own countermeasures. New churches were built near Templar sites, their designs deliberately chosen to interfere with the geometric patterns. Existing structures were modified, their proportions altered just enough to corrupt the encoded information without making the changes obvious. But the Templars had anticipated this response as well. The knowledge they had discovered beneath Solomon's temple wasn't stored in a single location or encoded in a single system. They had created redundancies, backup methods, alternative preservation techniques that could survive even systematic suppression. And they had trained initiates not just to guard the knowledge, but to recognize each other across generations, even centuries of separation. These initiates didn't need to gather in grand lodges or obvious meeting places. They could identify each other through subtle signs, shared understanding, and most importantly, through bloodlines that carried both the genetic markers and the cultural memory necessary to preserve the sacred lineage. By the time the church realized the full scope of what they were dealing with, it was too late. The knowledge had already spread beyond their ability to contain. It had taken root in noble families, merchant guilds, craftsman brotherhoods, and scholarly circles across Europe. Not as open rebellion against church authority, but as quiet preparation for a future transformation that might be centuries in the making. The Templars had accomplished something unprecedented in medieval history. They had created a distributed network of knowledge preservation that could survive the destruction of any individual component, including their own order. They had turned their persecution into a diaspora, scattering the seeds of change across the entire European continent. And they had done it all while maintaining absolute secrecy about the one thing that mattered most: the identity and location of the sacred bloodline they had sworn to protect. Because protecting that bloodline wasn't just about preserving ancient genealogies or honouring historical claims. It was about preparing for the day when the legitimate inheritors of divine authority would finally step out of the shadows and reclaim their rightful place as spiritual leaders of humanity. A day that might be coming sooner than anyone imagined. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded across generations like a slow-burning fuse, invisible to those who weren't trained to recognize the signs. By the mid-14th century, less than 50 years after the official destruction of the Templars, Europe began to change in ways that seemed entirely unconnected to the fallen order. New forms of art emerged. Painters began incorporating strange symbolic elements into religious works, geometric patterns that served no obvious decorative purpose, but carried meaning for those who knew how to interpret them. Sculptors carved seemingly innocent details into cathedral facades, flowers and animals and architectural flourishes that formed a visual language spanning hundreds of miles. The Renaissance wasn't just a rediscovery of classical learning. It was a carefully orchestrated revelation of knowledge that had been preserved through the dark centuries following the Templars' destruction. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci didn't stumble upon revolutionary techniques and ideas through individual genius alone. They were inheriting systematic instruction that had been passed down through networks of initiates who had maintained unbroken chains of transmission since the temple excavations. But the most significant changes were happening in places where few people thought to look. Banking evolved from simple money changing into complex international systems that moved wealth across continents with unprecedented efficiency. Trade routes shifted, connecting previously isolated regions and creating new flows of information alongside commerce. And most intriguingly, certain bloodlines began to consolidate power in ways that seemed almost supernaturally coordinated. The Medici family rose to dominance in Florence through banking innovations that bore striking resemblances to Templar financial techniques. The Habsburg dynasty expanded across Europe, using marriage alliances that followed patterns eerily similar to those described in captured Templar documents about preserving sacred lineages. Even the rise of nation-states themselves reflected organizational principles that the Templars had pioneered centuries earlier. These weren't coincidences. They were the fruits of a long-term strategy that treated political and economic transformation as secondary objectives. The primary goal remained unchanged from the early days beneath Solomon's temple: identifying, protecting, and eventually revealing the sacred bloodline that carried legitimate spiritual authority. The Protestant Reformation provided perfect cover for this gradual revelation. As established church authority fractured into competing denominations, the ground became fertile for alternative claims to spiritual legitimacy. Reformers spoke of returning to original Christianity, of sweeping away centuries of accumulated corruption and rediscovering authentic divine truth. They had no idea they were being guided by custodians of knowledge that predated Christianity itself. Martin Luther's challenges to papal authority weren't entirely his own innovations. The theological arguments he deployed, the scriptural interpretations he championed, even the political strategies he employed had been refined through centuries of underground scholarship by initiates who understood that open confrontation would always fail where gradual erosion might succeed. But the Reformation also created new dangers. As religious conflicts tore Europe apart, the delicate networks that had preserved Templar knowledge came under unprecedented strain. Wars scattered populations, destroyed libraries, and killed entire bloodlines that had maintained crucial links in the chain of transmission. The custodians adapted by going even deeper underground. They infiltrated emerging Protestant churches, Catholic counter-Reformation movements, and secular scholarly institutions with equal facility. They learned to speak multiple theological languages, to present the same core knowledge in forms that would appeal to Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, and Catholics alike. Most importantly, they began to prepare for a fundamental shift in strategy. The age of hidden preservation was drawing to a close. The time was approaching when the sacred bloodline would need to emerge from the shadows and assert its claim to spiritual leadership openly. The signs were becoming unmistakable. Astronomical calculations preserved in Templar documents pointed to specific dates when cosmic alignments would favor the revelation of hidden truth. Genealogical research had finally traced the sacred lineage through centuries of careful breeding and protection. And most crucially, political and social conditions were evolving toward a configuration that could support the transformation from secret preservation to public recognition. The American Revolution marked a crucial turning point. Here was a society being built from scratch, without the accumulated weight of feudal obligations and ecclesiastical hierarchies that made change so difficult in Europe. The Founding Fathers spoke of natural rights, divine providence, and revolutionary principles that echoed concepts the Templars had encoded in their architectural and symbolic systems. Many of these Founding Fathers were Freemasons, inheritors of traditions that claimed direct descent from medieval craft guilds, but carried knowledge that was far older and more sophisticated than simple building techniques. Their lodges practiced rituals that preserved fragments of the Templar initiation system, maintained symbols that encoded the same geometric principles found in Templar architecture, and most significantly, sworn oaths of mutual protection that mirrored the vows taken by Templar knights. The new American Republic became a testing ground for principles that the custodians had been refining for centuries. Religious freedom allowed multiple traditions to coexist without the violent conflicts that had torn Europe apart. Economic opportunity created social mobility that could elevate worthy individuals regardless of their birth status. And the separation of church and state established a framework where spiritual authority could operate independently of political power. For the first time since the Templar destruction, conditions existed where the sacred bloodline could begin to reveal itself without facing immediate persecution. But revelation required careful preparation. The American experiment was just the beginning of a transformation that would need to encompass the entire Western world before the final emergence could safely occur. The custodians turned their attention to Europe, where the old order was beginning to crack under pressures that seemed natural, but were actually being carefully orchestrated. The French Revolution eliminated the Bourbon monarchy and shattered the alliance between throne and altar that had persisted for over 1,000 years. The Napoleonic Wars redistributed power across the continent and created new opportunities for alternative forms of organization to take root. The Industrial Revolution transformed economic relationships and created new classes of people whose loyalty wasn't bound to traditional hierarchies. Each of these upheavals followed patterns that had been anticipated in Templar documents recovered from Jerusalem, not as prophecies, but as strategic plans based on deep understanding of how societies evolve and transform. The custodians weren't causing these changes directly, but they were positioning themselves to guide and channel the transformations in directions that would ultimately serve their primary objective. By the 19th century, the pieces were falling into place for the final phase of a plan that had been 7 centuries in the making. The sacred bloodline had been preserved through the darkest periods of persecution. The knowledge recovered from Solomon's temple had been encoded and transmitted through multiple independent channels. And most importantly, the social and political conditions necessary for the revelation of divine authority based on inheritance rather than appointment were finally beginning to emerge. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation in human spiritual history since the crucifixion itself. All that remained was choosing the right moment, the right circumstances, and the right inheritor to step forward and reclaim humanity's authentic spiritual leadership. But as the custodians prepared for this ultimate revelation, they discovered they weren't the only ones who had been watching and waiting through the centuries. Other forces, darker and more ruthless than anything they had anticipated, had also been tracking the sacred bloodline. And these forces had their own plans for what should happen when the inheritors finally emerged from the shadows. The final confrontation between authentic spiritual authority and its counterfeit imitators was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just the future of Christianity, but the spiritual destiny of humanity itself. Destiny of humanity itself. The 19th century brought whispers that chilled the blood of those who knew how to listen. In the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of Vienna, and the gentlemen's clubs of London, conversations took on an undercurrent of urgency that hadn't been felt since the Templar arrests 500 years earlier. Something was stirring in the shadows, and it wasn't the patient, methodical revelation that the custodians had spent centuries preparing. Other hands were reaching for the sacred bloodline. Hands that belonged to organizations with names that most people had never heard, but whose influence stretched into every palace, every parliament, and every cathedral in Europe. These weren't the careful guardians who had preserved ancient knowledge through love of truth. These were predators who understood that whoever controlled the legitimate inheritors of divine authority would possess power beyond imagination. The signs were subtle, but unmistakable to those trained to recognize them. Academic expeditions began appearing in regions where genealogical research had identified potential bloodline survivors. Archaeological digs commenced at sites connected to Templar activity, but the artifacts discovered mysteriously vanished before scholars could examine them. Most telling of all, certain noble families found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny from investigators who claimed to represent historical societies, but asked questions that had nothing to do with academic research. These new players in the ancient game brought resources that dwarfed anything the custodians had ever possessed. They commanded networks of agents across multiple continents. They had infiltrated governments at the highest levels. And most dangerously, they had developed techniques for manipulating bloodlines that went far beyond simple genealogical tracking. So there you have it, 7 centuries of hidden truth, scattered across Europe like seeds on fertile ground. The Templars didn't just discover relics beneath Solomon's temple. They unearthed something far more dangerous than Rome ever imagined. a secret that could rewrite the very foundations of divine authority, transform how we understand spiritual succession, and reveal bloodlines that still walk among us today. The empty vaults weren't the end of the story, they were just the beginning. Because while kings counted coins and popes burned heretics, the real treasure was already moving through shadows, encoded in symbols, preserved in stone, and carried forward in blood that refuses to be silenced. The question isn't whether this knowledge survived the flames of 1307. The question is whether you're ready to recognize the signs when they finally emerge from centuries of careful concealment. Because the custodians are still watching. The bloodline endures, and the final revelation may be closer than any of us dare to imagine.